Heavy or light, which one is right? Find out tonight. 4FTV. Let's go. What's going on, everybody? It's Brian and Ben with 4FTV, where we cover everything from faith, family, fitness, and freedom. And today we're talking about, there we go. Should I lift heavy or should I lift light? Find out tonight which one's right. Let's kick it off, Ben. Let's actually just get right into it. We're going to start making these episodes a little bit shorter and more concise for you guys, more digestible. And when we get more of you begging for longer ones, we'll start going long again. But as far as this one, we got some really good information jam-packed into 20 to 30 minutes for you. So our first one, light weights, risks, reward. How should someone start if they're entering light weights, Ben?
Well, I think it's interesting that you put them in this order. I had them in the other order when I was making notes. It actually is a little bit more intelligent and advantageous to start in a lighter range. And to clear that up, when I say light weights, I do not mean like, we've all been in the gym. If you've been in the gym before, you probably even have like an aunt or a grandma who has a set of 2-pound dumbbells that she, uses every once in a while just to make sure that she, right. And the answer is almost always the same. I think there was an episode of The Office where they got locked outside the building and Michael Scott pulled a set of dumbbells from his car. And someone's like, what are those, like 6-pounders? And he's like, I'm going for tone. Right.
Exactly.
And so I don't mean light like that light, where you might as well just be lifting a water bottle. And so when we're talking about light, I'm categorizing things in the lighter, more so not super heavy rep range between like 6 and 15. Okay. And so one of the reasons why you should start in that lighter range or window is that our connective tissues take way longer to adapt and grow and increase in density than just our actual, contractile tissue or muscle. So when you start off doing heavy rep ranges like that 1 to 5 rep range, that puts way more strain on those connective tissues. And I've seen it before. You've seen it before. Someone decides to get into lifting. They just watch the CrossFit Games or World's Strongest Man or something like that. Or maybe you're in high school and
saw Larry Wheels
video. Right,
IG.
Exactly. Yeah, they obviously didn't see the one where the guy's pec like detached from his sternum entirely.
Right.
And so there are risks and rewards to a lot of different aspects of lifting and which way you approach it. Getting in that more hypertrophic range, that 6 to 15 rep range, is not just more advantageous because you're not going to be able to execute correct form attempting to lift heavy right away when you are not established in kind of motor memory or muscle memory with those movements in the first place. And the last thing you want to do is go into the gym and end up getting injured while you're trying to prove something. I've had clients that have done that, both male and female. My back hurts, this, that. I did something. What happened? Well, I tried deadlifting 225, and it's a girl who weighs 140 pounds, right? And she has no powerlifting background at all, but she saw she saw some Instagram influencer. Don't even get me started on that. Do that, and then so she decides, like, in order to be where she is, I've got to also be able to deadlift 225, and just decided to go in and try it. Right.
A lot of people don't realize too that with the light weights, I mean, as Ben said, you have to actually master form because it's going to break down, especially if you're in that 12 to 15 rep range or even pushing to 20, if you're going for even more like muscular endurance on top of hypertrophy. But those are the things where skill breaks down fast. But you also realize that when you start lifting with hypertrophy and endurance and these longer rep ranges, you actually build a bit of an endurance in like an aerobic capacity for lifting, which a lot of people don't realize. When you get into heavy lifting, you need some aerobic capacity to keep the set going, to keep the recovery going. So starting off lighter, besides one of the rewards is you're less likely to get injured unless you're just an absolute idiot around your form. It also is sort of like foundational stepping stones to earn the right to lift heavy in my mind.
True. And that is correct. Your more hypertrophic range is going to favor not just muscle growth, which is most people, not everybody, most people going into the gym are there to make some aesthetic changes.
especially men.
Yep. And well, yeah, I would say it used to be especially men, and now, and I would say that those things are probably pretty close to almost even with the amount of women that are
Well, at least women are realizing like you're not testosterone dominant, so
right.
you're not going to blow up like a guy blows up.
It
If
used
you
to
lift
be, yeah, it
heavy.
used to be like women acted like, they had like a high allergic reaction to cast iron, and they would
Right.
avoid
They
the
had to have
dumb.
the rubber weights with Jane
Right,
Fonda
right,
going.
right, exactly. And so not only does that rep range favor hypertrophy, and those aesthetic or visual changes, but it also increases, you're going to have a higher caloric expenditure during those lifting
That's true.
sessions in that range than you are doing the heavier ranges, if that makes sense. And with, even though that was kind of categorized as pros and cons of the heavy ranges, when you lift in that 1 to 5 rep window to failure roughly, the recycle period for your body to be able to execute those lifts and those numbers and sustain those again is longer, because it takes longer for your adenosine triphosphate, creatine phosphate energy system to kind of reset itself and go
Right.
back in there and perform those weights again.
Well, and we'll get into that in the next point as well. But you also start realizing that heavier weights have more of uh, a neuro response in your body, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more of the CNS being taxed out with heavy lifting compared to light lifting. And as Ben said, your goal in weightlifting should never be calories as the only metric I measure a successful session by, because when you're lifting weights, the goal isn't necessarily to burn as many calories as you can in the session. It's to create a stimulus on muscles that will break them down and build them up with proper sleep, recovery, nutrition, so that your basal metabolic rate, as we've talked in past episodes, that BMR, that baseline of homeostasis increases.
Mm-hmm.
So weightlifting is the only way you can get your BMR higher, other than also retraining metabolism and other things we won't get into today. But this lightweight lifting will still create a stimulus to break down muscle and build muscle. It won't be the same stimulus as heavy lifting, but you will burn more calories and you'll still set the proper foundation in place. So when you're first starting out lifting, that's where you might be like, oh man, when I did lighter weights in these successive circuits where it was 30 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and I ran it for 20 straight minutes, I burned 300 calories in 20 minutes. And it's like, yeah, because your heart rate was going the whole
Mm-hmm.
time. Whereas as you start to get heavier and it takes much longer to recover, your heart rate's going to drop down as well. And you're not going to see the same calorie burn, which for some of you may be the reward of lifting lighter. Again, maybe in the beginning that's okay, but as you mature in your lifting, try not to make that a main metric of your lifts. But yeah, to wrap up light weights, everyone should lift light at first to master form, to build some form of muscular endurance, and to set the foundations properly so you minimize your risk, because you can still get hurt. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if I just start doing this with a 2-pound weight, like eventually my shoulder is going to go out, my elbow is going to feel like shit. Like you can get hurt, but there's not that many risks to lightweight, other than you may never actually put the muscle on your frame that creates a greater stimulus for your metabolism. It's going to be easier and easier to adapt. So you're either going to have to start going longer sessions, or eventually you would have to lift the weights. It's not really a risk, but it's like after a while, that plateau is inevitably going to hit you a little easier than heavy weights, where it's a much slower progression, but it also is a much longer period of being able to progress in the same movement.
Yeah, and I like I said, I want to clarify too, not lightweight in the sense of not reaching that limit strength fatigue threshold or close to it. A lot of research has been done for a long time. I was actually looking at some PubMed studies just earlier today when it comes to heavier light and intensity, meaning all of the stuff we heard about training to failure, right? Like all the stuff for a while was like, if you want to gain muscle, you have to train to like eye bleeding levels of way past initial failure and intensity. And one of the things that they've kind of discovered as time has gone by is that those examples in those studies happened to be exposing themselves to higher volumes of training as well. Not just simply training yourself to utter failure, for one set. Although the Mike Mentzer, Dorian Yates, and some other similar related Nautilus method principles advocate that you can do that. In most cases, these guys were also training with a pretty substantial amount of volume. Right. And since then, they've discovered that training close to failure within like 2 to 5 reps of complete failure is effective for triggering the response to your body to build muscle tissue and get stronger. And that's what I mean. And the reason other thing is that range. Some people say like that's a big range, like 6 to 15, and some people even say 6 to 20. But there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, there's a genetic factor. Like there's a reason why some people are sprinters and some people are marathon runners or whatever. We do have some variations in our fiber types or VO2 capacity, and then even if you look at different parts of the body. I was reading about, some of the leg development and training theories that went back a while and how there was some contrast there. And one of the things they didn't, discover until we had the capacity or technology to look into that is that of the 4 muscles that make up your quadriceps, one of them has a higher concentration of slow twitch fibers, right? And so there's a reason why that range looks big. It's like, 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 sounds like really concise. And like 6 to 15 or 6 to 20 sounds like a crazy range, right?
Right.
But there's multiple reasons for that. And that's what I meant is that when you're getting into the gym, without referencing all the CrossFit injuries and other things that hit the scene over the last several years, there's a reason why you shouldn't be trying to do a 1 or 3 rep max.
Well, and one last reward I'll put with lightweight training too. It's still relative to the individual. My light is going to be someone else's heavy.
For sure.
And my heavy is going to be someone else's light. But Phil Heath, who is a famous bodybuilder, multiple-time Mr. Olympia, also said, especially when it came to certain body parts, he only trained them light. And it was about maximizing time under tension, blood flow into the muscle, and really working on contracting each rep. And also one of the rewards of lifting light, if you can understand what actual lightweight ranges like 50-60% max instead of 80-90% maxes are, you're going to preserve your joints a lot better too. When you chronically lift heavy, which is something we'll get into in point 2, the risks and rewards of heavy weights, one of the risks you have to understand is the heavier and heavier and heavier you go, especially outside of compound movements. When you start getting into isolated heavy movements, but even compounds, your squat, your deadlift, your row, pull-ups, bench press, overhead press, those are the typical 6. The heavier and heavier you go, the more possibility of joint breakdown you're going to run into, where if you really are not like massaging, hot and cold therapy, like pain relief, if you don't really step up your pain management and recovery game outside of the gym, there's a great chance like that shoulder is going to get hurt, or because the elbow's feeling weak, you're going to compensate the path of how you push a shoulder press, how you push a bench press. When I squat, my hips might move to adjust for the fact that one of my hips is tight, one of my quads is weaker, one of my ankles is less mobile. And that also, in my mind, is a reward of heavy lifting because it exposes the weaknesses in a person. It's easy to get away with bad form with light weights because you can just keep doing whatever you want. But the heavier you go, it really is a true risk reward factor where if you have bad form, there's a higher risk of injury. But as you get heavier, the reward is if you're actually paying attention and not driven by your ego, you will quickly find out where your imbalances and issues are in your body.
True. Yeah. And then even when it comes to lifting heavy, like exercise, mitigating the risk and reward disparity, a lot of that comes down to is application. So just because, personal application, just because you saw somebody on Instagram, or like I said, the world's strongest man or the CrossFit Games, doing cleans with X amount of weight or deadlifts or this or that, having conversations with people in that space, including, I had about 3 different opportunities to work out with Brian Shaw and talking to him about that. and just getting to hang out with him for a day and talking about, training, kind of theories and stuff like that. And I don't know if you know or not, but in his background, he actually played college basketball.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Before
that's a big boy playing
I know.
basketball.
Well, he wasn't, okay. So he wasn't 400. He wasn't 400 pounds when he played basketball, but he's still a big dude. Right. And so we talked about that. And then, Robert Oberst talked about this too. I can't remember if it was if it was on the Joe Rogan podcast, another podcast interview he did, but he basically was saying, doing exercise like a deadlift, barbell deadlift, be specific, heavier and heavier and heavier to try to find out how much you can lift. Unless you are training for some kind of event where you might have the chance of getting a title that's worthwhile, that's gonna somehow come into play with your career accolades and stuff like that. It is not worth it for the average person, and it's not even applicable for the average person. So, finding out how much you can deadlift for 8 reps, honestly, for the average person is more functional than 1. Maybe using a trap bar or doing a single arm deadlift variation instead of the
I'm all about the trap bar.
Right. Instead of the likelihood or risk of forward rounding that you're going to find with the barbell and that much more lumbosacral pressure, vertebral compression and stuff like that. It's going to be way smarter and a way more functional approach to kind of look into variations of that instead of, like I said, you doing it because you saw it on the gram.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, or don't get Ben wrong with what he just said too. If you end up finding out your 1 rep max, that's awesome. I would suggest doing it with a trainer or a coach or someone well-trained in spotting form and teaching you, like, just because we're finding the 1 rep max doesn't mean you forget about rest periods or things, or like intra set, meaning in the middle of the set, like mobility movements or other things to prime the body in between sets. But Ben's absolutely right. And that was one of the things I was going to mention with lightweights, but it can be mentioned right now too. Light and heavy is like, this is a very surface level beginner conversation we're having in this podcast, because light weights trained for explosiveness or speed are also totally different training metrics. Because a lot of athletes, and this is where what we'll get into in part 3 when we talk about the purpose of your training, but a lot of athletes need to go through a block of 6, 8, 12 weeks in the off season, get stronger, build a little more muscle, build more connective tissue, strengthen the bones, push the limit a little and get stronger. But once an athlete is in season, it's stupid to train heavy. So just like all of you, it's like you may go through a block of going heavy to push the limit, create a different stimulus for your body, try to create more growth, because heavy lifting is also going to have a positive impact on your testosterone and HGH, but it still needs to be periodized over a period where after a while, I got to change my training mechanism. I need to work explosive for high reps. I need to work power for low reps. Instead of just getting as strong as possible, how much power can I create in 1 or 2 lifts and then go into only 1 or 2 sets, then move to the next exercise, then the next. Like a lot of athletes, instead of 4 or 5 exercises, do 12 to 15 exercises a workout, but it's like 1 to 2 sets of stuff working, power, explosiveness, all of that. So heavy weights are incredibly beneficial, but so are light weights. There's risks and rewards to both, and it should be periodized. And any good trainer is going to give you what you want, but also give you what you need. You're going to have things that you want to do. That's fine. But the agreement is, if the trainer or coach gives you what you want, you're also going to do what he tells you to do, which means, like, if we got to back down on deadlifts, even if we're in a heavy phase, because I'm seeing a breakdown in form and we need to address something, do it. He or she is trying to save you in the long run. I've had so many times, and I can tell you the reason I never deadlift anymore outside of trap bar deadlifts is because I have a very bad lumbar spine. I have 3 degenerative discs. I've had it blown out like 5 times, multiple times, not even lifting. I just stepped the wrong way and my spine, my spinal integrity isn't great. So It's taken years. I went 2 years without squatting or deadlifting at all. Worked very lightweight lunges, lightweight step ups, and other leg things, but did not deadlift, did not squat, and my body was fine. So also don't think if you don't do some of these lifts or if you have to go away from them for a season, it's a bad thing. It's not. You
True.
can lift. I know, you know, it would be beneficial for more people than not. Learn how to do a heavy Bulgarian split squat because
Absolutely.
it's unilateral, it's challenging balance, it's challenging individual limb strength. You can load the hamstring and glute more, you can make it more quad dominant, and it's still, in my mind, safer because there's no load on the spine.
Mm-hmm.
It's something else. You can front load it to create a stress stimulus. You can side load it. You can do it. What I like to do, besides being unilateral, is only hold a weight in one side. So then my obliques have to get involved as well.
Mm-hmm.
But that's getting a little too nuanced for this conversation. But the point is, you can training heavy also doesn't mean max deadlift, max squat, max bench press. It can also mean what's the heaviest lunge you can do, which may only be 40% of the heaviest squat you can do.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, it's going to create way more balance of strength and symmetry and neuromuscular connectivity than only training bilaterally.
Sure. Oh, that's absolutely correct. And if you think about a lot of again, it's application, whether it's sports application or just when it comes to life, we do things that look like deadlifts. We pick up groceries, we walk,
Yep.
we walk in the garage and grab the wheelbarrow full of stuff to do yard work or whatever. We're doing very similar movements to those. But we also do movements like go upstairs, like you said, where you're working more unilaterally. There's a lot of different reasons why. Like I said, unless there's something in the cards potentially for you to gain a lot, increasing the load in those lower rep ranges, again, progressively. We know this, the human form has its limits. And even though we've seen people come and break records here and there, at no point in time are those limits not still going to be there to a degree. Right. And the closer you get to pushing the threshold of those limits, in that extreme, again, it's just inherently going to increase that risk factor, and it might not really benefit or behoove you, in any wise sense, to do that when you could be doing something else. Again, if your goal is, I'm training for life, I got 4 kids I'm trying to keep up with, I want to look good for myself and my spouse, whatever else it is, there's no need for you to find out if you can deadlift 400, 500, 600 pounds.
And I'll tell every one of you as well. Again, we're not demonizing deadlifts or squats, but for the majority of you, honestly, unilateral training should be your focus, because more people are not lunges and step ups transfer to everyday life and movement way more than a set in place bilateral deadlift or bilateral squat. Learning to get strong in unilateral positions or multi-plane, which is like if I lunge to the side, or if I lunge to the side, stand up, rotate, press, things where I have to go forward, sideways, and rotational all at the same time. That's life. I could pick my kid up and have to put them over here. There's so many things that when we think about traditional heavy weights, it's not going to carry over as much to life. It's going to be a great training stimulus, and again, can help with muscle building, bone density, test production, HGH production, all these beneficial things, and getting strong. You do need to have a certain level of strength to function in this world. But a lot of people neglect mobile strength, mobility and strength together, multi-planar strength. So I would suggest that if you come out of this episode, one thing that would be great for you guys to ask is, what's the purpose that you're training for? Just as Ben and I have alluded to, and we're going to make point 3 pretty quick, but if you're an athlete, again, off season, you usually have a rest period of a week or 2, and then you're right back into it. You ramp up training for 2 to 4 weeks, and then you usually go through a 6 to 8 week block of heavy weights, training, get stronger, push the edge, whatever. As you get closer and closer to the season, you start ramping down. You work explosive, you work power. And then most of the time when you're in season, it's usually endurance, because most athletes outside of like offensive and defensive linemen or linebackers in football, you don't need maximal strength paired with endurance. You just need enough muscle on your frame. That's why you can look at receivers that are twigs, but they're still strong enough to do stuff. Now, if they're getting wrecked by a lineman every day, like that's going to hurt them eventually.
Right.
But like basketball players, you tend to see big capped shoulders, skinnier arms, strong legs, but usually skinny legs, big butts, because the butts are like the powerhouse for sprinting and jumping. But look at the sport and understand, like, if I'm trying to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger but play basketball, there's a misalignment there.
For sure.
That doesn't make sense to train to be a bodybuilder, to isolate muscle groups one muscle at a time, if I'm in a sport that demands 50 muscles to fire at once.
Yeah. Like I said, it all comes down to application. Even when we weren't trying to vilify deadlifts. Like, let's look at a bench press, for example. There's a handful of very worthwhile strength coaches that have addressed the issue of the barbell flat bench press, right? How it ended up, in some kind of infamy in high schools everywhere, and whose name is on the board for benching enough or whatever.
Yeah.
Mechanically speaking, it's way smarter to do an incline press or a decline press or a dip.
Yes.
But let's look at the bench press. Even since you mentioned, professional football players, when you do the test for your efficiency and your output, they really don't care how much you can bench for one rep. Unlike high school, they want to know how many times you can do 225, which for those athletes, it's not really a heavy weight. It's an endurance test. It's a strength endurance test. And so when these guys are taking off 20 plus reps with 225, that is, again, the quintessential athlete we all look up to. That's proof positive right there, that especially if you're just a weekend warrior, you're a parent trying to get your groove back, there's no need for you to spend an excessive amount of your training trying to figure out how much you can bench for one rep. As a matter of fact, I would even say it's straight up stupid.
It is. And statistically speaking, you are 400 times more likely to tear your pec on a flat barbell bench press than you are on a chest fly. And most people have demonized chest flies, but that adduction of the chest is a huge mechanical function of the chest that can't get trained on a flat barbell bench press. That's why cables are better. That's why dumbbells are better. Or as Ben said, incline chest press is superior in all ways. And if you're going to go decline, usually you're pretty well set up doing dips because it's so functional. It hits your chest, your triceps, your shoulders, everything. The flat bench is the most overrated move in the entire thing. And just like Ben said, don't know how it became the measure of all bros, but even more than your deadlift or squat, your bench press somehow matters. And I would love any high schoolers watching this. Nobody gives a shit. Like your bros might care and they might want to give you shit, but guess what? Kevin Durant couldn't even put up 135 at his combine one time. And that has pretty much not changed, that he's one of the best to ever do it. Yeah. And I know that's basketball, but even football or boxing, it's just there's a lot more functional things. And to the everyday person watching this, even athletes, my challenge to you, because I think there's so much carryover, get good with kettlebells and work multiplanar movements. Learn how to get 5, 10, 20 muscles working together at once, where if I reach down in one direction, I pull up, I move forward, I rotate, I change, like all those things. And this is for moms and dads and anyone else. Learning to work unilateral multiplanar kettlebell movements will probably have more carryover to your day-to-day life than barbell lifting, lightweight or heavyweight. There's a little more functionality with kettlebells. That's why I've started incorporating it with clients, because you can still put a 100-pound kettlebell in a hand and do a heavy press, a heavy lunge, any of that stuff. But the load is also different. There's no spinal compromisation. I don't know if
Compression.
that's a word.
Yeah, and it
Compression and
definitely,
compromise at the
yeah,
same time.
it definitely can limit it. And even then, again, we can get into the nitty gritty and the nooks and crannies. But if you are going to flat bench press because you like to, and your mind rests easier knowing that you are, hitting your chest from a flat position, use dumbbells.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
again, I'm not,
Way
and
more
I'm,
natural on the shoulders.
it allows wrist and shoulder, movement and coordination that's far more natural, mechanically.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And back to the whole, and are there advantages to lifting heavy? Brian touched on this earlier. One of them is that, lifting in that heavier rep range does teach you to be neurally efficient. And I hate to use the term explosive, but that is applicable in this conversation. But again, on the other side, that's a double-edged sword. More efficient and explosive facilitation of your neuromuscular capacity also brings the ballistic risk of the nature of lifting that heavy, which is if you have compromised, if you have a weak link somewhere in the chain, or you've been overtraining, the chances of you,
find out.
yeah, you're gonna find out today. Exactly. And so that's just something to think about. It's not that one of them is like, the evil twin of the other, but by far and large, I will say, from observing trends in the industry, and again, I'm not vilifying or demonizing one or the other, but I've talked to Olympic lifting coaches years ago, and they've told me, if I get someone that comes to me and their background is bodybuilding or their background is something similar to that at these particular ages, he's like, I'll tell them not to do Olympic lifting outside of into the workout, kind of light conditioning stuff. If you're trying to just kind of get familiar with the movement patterns, because your muscle memory and your mobility and very specific movements is contraindicative to you being an Olympic lifter. And it's just going to be a high risk factor for you to try to do what these Olympic lifters have been doing their whole lives. Right. And so that's just something to think about. We have seen increases with the popularity of CrossFit and stuff like that. And, injuries, a pretty serious increase in injuries. And part of that's because some of these gyms are leaning heavy on like, what's your 1 rep max? Let's put up bigger numbers up on the board. And does it make you feel good for a moment? For sure. But again, is it applicable from a very functional standpoint and from a, kind of risk and reward standpoint? I don't really think so.
Right. And we could make a whole segment on CrossFit as well, because there's very few very good CrossFit coaches, and done properly, it's one of the best things you can do to build an incredible body. But more often than not, if you're not a good student to be trained and you don't have a good coach that can train a student, you will get hurt, because they do not program that intellectually. They usually put a 1 rep max paired with a sprint, paired with something where there's too many training categories lumped into one workout, where if I'm trying to find power, I should not follow it up with explosive movements as well. If I have to recover from a 1 or 2 rep deadlift or clean, why would I immediately go into sprinting on the rower, sprinting on the ground, like assault bike, whatever? Like there's a lot of risk there, but I've already gone too far into it than we should have. But basically, guys, we hope this was at least a beginning stepping stone for all of you watching, to understand if you should lift heavy or lift light. And it would mean the world if you smash the like button right now, if you found value in the conversation that we just had with all of you on this episode. Leave a comment below, because again, we covered a lot in the last 30 minutes. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. Send us your training in the comments. Say, hey, this is the lightweight training I've been doing. What do you think? Here's the heavyweight training I've been doing. What do you think? And we'd be happy to just give you our opinions on it as coaches, as trainers, as just people that love exercising and have been involved in workout, sports, athletics, and the whole lot for our entire lives. But don't forget to subscribe either, because like I said, every Friday, 5 a.m. Pacific, 8 a.m. Eastern, we release a podcast episode. And now that we're starting to do shorter episodes, we might put out a couple a week. But we need to hear from you. We need to know, do you want us to stick on these fitness contents? Do you want us to go into life like some of the other ones? Do you want us to talk about the latest topics and how it relates? We cover it all here between Faith, Family, Fitness, and Freedom on 4FTV. But thank you guys again for joining us. I'm Brian. This is Ben. And we just hope you have a wonderful, blessed day. And we'll see you next week.